way!
Nice try.
You think a shiny badge gets you out of a stop?
That badge is real, officer.
Anybody can buy a fake badge online! Step out of the vehicle. Now!
Chief Medical Examiner, call dispatch. Verify it.
Wednesday, 10:30 a.m. The downtown business district hummed with a predictable, expensive rhythm. It was the kind of neighborhood where the architecture was a seamless mix of restored historic brick and sleek tinted glass. The wide sidewalks were meticulously swept, and pedestrians walked with the hurried purpose of people whose time was billed by the hour. Delivery trucks were relegated to back alleys, leaving the main avenues clear for luxury sedans and high-end SUVs. It was a perfectly curated slice of the city, a place that thrived on order, quiet wealth, and unspoken rules about who belonged. Christopher Hall fit seamlessly into this environment, a man whose presence commanded a quiet, undeniable authority. He was 45 years old, a black man with a close-cropped haircut, a sharp jawline, and the heavy, unblinking gaze of someone who spent his life analyzing details others missed. He wore an impeccably tailored dark gray wool turtleneck and charcoal trousers, projecting strict, understated minimalism. Before we see how this routine morning turns into a career-ending nightmare for one arrogant cop, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments what city or country you're watching from today. Christopher sat legally parked in a metered space along the bustling avenue. His vehicle was an extension of his demeanor, a brand new flagship BMW X5. It was painted a deep, glossy black, polished to a mirror finish that seemed to absorb the morning light. The engine was completely turned off. Inside the soundproofed cabin, the noise of the city was reduced to a dull hum. It smelled of rich leather and faint, expensive cologne. Christopher held a half-empty cup of espresso in one hand and his smartphone in the other, slowly scrolling through complex forensic reports. His schedule was notoriously unforgiving, a relentless cycle of death, science, and the courtroom. These 15 minutes of absolute silence before his next meeting at the district attorney's office were a rare sanctuary. He wasn't playing loud music. He wasn't violating any ordinances. He was simply taking a breather in a public space. Enter Officer Miller. The veteran patrolman was cruising the district in his black and white Ford Explorer, driving at a slow, deliberate crawl. Miller considered himself a proactive, old-school cop. He wasn't just patrolling, he was actively hunting for anomalies. He scanned the storefronts and the rows of parked cars, his eyes searching for anything that broke the pristine pattern of his precinct. As the heavy police cruiser rolled past the line of metered spots, Miller's eyes locked onto the immaculate black BMW X5. It wasn't just the car that caught his attention. Miller looked through the driver's side window and saw Christopher. The officer's posture shifted immediately. His hands tightened their grip on the steering wheel. Miller didn't reach for his radio to call in a suspicious vehicle. He didn't type the BMW's license plate into his terminal to check the registration. He didn't witness a traffic violation or any erratic behavior. He simply looked at the $100,000 German SUV, looked at the black man sitting quietly inside, and made a split-second, hardwired decision. Through the tinted windshield, Christopher didn't even notice the patrol car passing by. But in his rearview mirror, the narrative was rapidly changing. The cruiser slowed to an unnatural crawl. The bright red brake lights flared intensely. For a brief second, the patrol car sat completely motionless in the active traffic lane, ignoring the honk of an annoyed delivery truck behind it. Suddenly, Miller turned the steering wheel hard. He slammed his foot on the gas. The cruiser's heavy tires chirped aggressively against the asphalt as Miller executed a sharp, illegal U-turn directly across the solid double yellow lines. The heavy Ford Explorer whipped around, accelerating for just a fraction of a second before Miller slammed on the brakes. The cruiser came to a violent halt directly behind the BMW X5. The push bumper stopped less than 2 feet from Christopher's rear bumper, deliberately boxing him in. Inside the quiet sanctuary of the SUV, Christopher slowly lifted his eyes from his smartphone. He looked into his rearview mirror. The reflection was instantly painted in blinding, chaotic flashes of red and blue. Officer Miller had flipped on his overhead light bar. There was no siren, just the aggressive rhythmic strobes bouncing off the BMW's glossy black paint and illuminating the quiet interior with a harsh glare. It was an unmistakable display of force. Christopher didn't flinch. His hands didn't shake. His heart rate didn't spike. As a man who spent his professional life analyzing trauma and violence, he possessed a clinical, unnerving level of detachment. He understood the mechanics of intimidation better than the man currently parking behind him. Christopher locked the screen of his smartphone and methodically placed it into the center console cup holder. He kept his hands completely visible, resting them lightly on the bottom of the leather steering wheel, and watched the side mirror. He heard the heavy thud of the cruiser's door swinging open. He saw the reflection of Officer Miller stepping out. The officer's boots crunched heavily on the pavement as he began his approach. Before taking his first step, Miller hitched his heavy nylon duty belt, resting his right hand casually, but deliberately, on the grip of his holstered firearm. It was a subtle gesture designed to establish dominance. Miller walked up to the driver's side window, fully expecting to dictate the terms to a nervous civilian. But as he approached the glass, Officer Miller had absolutely no idea that he had just boxed in the chief medical examiner, a man who held enough systemic power to dismantle his entire career with a single phone call. The heavy rhythmic thud of Officer Miller's boots stopped just behind the driver's side door. It was a classic tactical position, standing slightly behind the B-pillar of the vehicle, forcing the driver to turn their head awkwardly to make eye contact. It was a physical maneuver designed to put the civilian at an immediate psychological disadvantage. Inside the BMW, the soft, mechanical hum of the electric window motor broke the silence. The tinted glass smoothly rolled down, letting in the sharp morning air, the distant wail of a siren, and the abrasive presence of Officer Miller. Miller leaned in slightly, resting his left hand on the roof of the SUV. He didn't immediately speak. Instead, he used the first few seconds of the encounter to perform a visual sweep. His eyes darted past Christopher, aggressively scanning the pristine leather interior, the center console, the passenger seat, and the floorboards. He was looking for a reason. An open container, a suspicious bag, a scent, a sudden movement, anything that could instantly transform this baseless traffic stop into a full-blown felony search. He found absolutely nothing. The cabin was immaculate. Frustrated but undeterred, Miller shifted his gaze to the man behind the wheel. Standard police procedure dictates that an officer should immediately identify themselves and state the reason for the stop. Officer Miller did neither. He bypassed protocol entirely and launched straight into a fishing expedition, relying on the quiet, implied threat of the badge pinned to his chest. "Morning," Miller said. His voice was casual, but it carried the distinct, heavy undertone of an interrogation. "You waiting for somebody around here?" It was a loaded question. If Christopher said yes, Miller would demand to know who, where, and why. If he said no, Miller would use it as a pretext to question why he was loitering in a high-income commercial district. Christopher didn't turn his body. He simply turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto the officers. He didn't offer a nervous smile. He didn't drop his hands from the steering wheel. He didn't exhibit a single micro-expression of the anxiety or deference that Miller was so accustomed to extracting from people. "No," Christopher replied. His voice was a flat, unyielding surface, cold, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. "I am checking my emails." The brevity of the answer hung in the air. For a cop like Miller, a civilian who wasn't nervous was a civilian who was hiding something, or worse, a civilian who didn't respect his authority. The utter lack of submission in Christopher's tone instantly bruised the officer's fragile ego. Miller's jaw tightened. He decided to press harder, dropping the thin veil of neighborhood friendliness. "You work in one of these buildings?" Miller asked, his eyes narrowing as he looked Christopher up and down, quietly judging the tailored turtleneck and the lack of a corporate lanyard. "Yes," Christopher answered, just the one word. He offered no elaboration, no company name, no attempt to prove his right to exist on this street. He was a man accustomed to cross-examining expert witnesses and dismantling defense attorneys. He knew exactly how to starve an interrogation of oxygen. Miller's irritation was now visible. He shifted his weight, his hand resting closer to his duty belt. He needed to regain control of the narrative. He needed to put this man on the defensive. If the driver wasn't going to incriminate himself through conversation, Miller would attack the most obvious target, the $100,000 vehicle. Miller let out a short, humorless exhale. He patted the roof of the BMW with a gloved hand. "Nice ride." "Belongs to you?" "It does," Christopher said, his gaze never wavering. "Is that right?" Miller replied, the skepticism dripping heavily from his words. The officer took a step back, looking down the sleek length of the black SUV as if inspecting it for damage. He had reached the point of no return. He had initiated the stop based on pure bias, and now he needed a bureaucratic shield to justify it. He reached into his mental playbook and pulled out the oldest, most overused excuse in modern policing. "Here's the thing," Miller said, leaning back into the window frame, his voice hardening into an authoritative bark. "We've had a severe string of luxury vehicle thefts in this precinct lately, high-end SUVs specifically. Guys coming into this neighborhood, looking for easy targets, and driving off before the owners even finish their coffee." Miller paused, waiting for Christopher to look offended or scared. Christopher simply blinked, his expression as readable as a slab of granite. "So," Miller continued, his tone turning sharp and demanding, "I need to verify the ownership of this vehicle. I need to see your driver's license, vehicle registration, and proof of insurance. Right now." Officer Miller thought he had just won the exchange. He thought he had successfully cornered a suspect, using the law as a weapon to validate his own prejudice. He was completely unaware that he had just demanded documentation from a man who carried a badge that outranked his entire chain of command. Officer Miller stood by the open window, waiting for the inevitable. He was waiting for the stuttering, the nervous fumbling for a wallet, or the desperate defensive arguments he dealt with every single day on patrol. He wanted the driver to raise his voice or refuse the order, providing the exact legal pretext Miller needed to drag him out of the car. Christopher Hall did none of those things. He didn't ask why he was being singled out. He didn't point out the glaring absurdity of a supposed car thief casually answering emails in the financial district. Christopher knew arguing with a street cop on a power trip was a waste of oxygen. Instead, Christopher gave Miller complete mechanical compliance. But he did it with a chilling, clinical detachment that felt more like a threat than submission. "I am going to reach into the glove compartment for my registration," Christopher stated. His voice was flat and precise, sounding like a surgeon dictating notes during an autopsy. "And then I am going to reach into my inner left jacket pocket for my identification." Christopher narrated his movements to completely neutralize the situation. He was removing any shadow of a doubt, any sudden flinch that Miller could later claim made him fear for his life. Miller's hand hovered instinctively over the grip of his holster, but Christopher's movements were agonizingly slow. He popped open the glove box and retrieved a leather document holder. Then, sitting back up, he reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a credential wallet. He didn't just hand over a plastic card. He passed the entire stack of documents through the window. Miller snatched the items, stepping back slightly. He looked first at the vehicle registration. Owner, Christopher Hall. He checked the VIN visible through the windshield. A perfect match. The narrative of the stolen luxury SUV evaporated instantly. Miller shifted his gaze to the driver's license. The photo matched. The address listed was in one of the most exclusive zip codes in the county. Then, his eyes drifted down to the black leather wallet resting beneath the paperwork. It wasn't a cheap security tin. It was a heavy, intricate, solid gold-toned shield featuring the deeply engraved seal of the state. Right below it, securely behind a clear window, was a thick government ID card with a secure barcode and a title printed in bold, heavy lettering: Chief Medical Examiner. Office of the District Attorney. The realization hit Miller hard. He had just initiated a baseless, racially motivated stop on the man who ran the county morgue, the man whose forensic testimony could make or break the very homicide cases Miller's own department built. A smart cop would have handed the badge back immediately, muttered an apology about a misunderstanding, and walked away. But Miller stood frozen. Heavy silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic. Miller stared down at the gold shield, his thumb rubbed aggressively over the engraved metal. His jaw tightened, a visible pulse ticking in his neck. He looked from the heavy badge back to Christopher's calm, unbothered expression. He couldn't accept it. Instead of backing down, Officer Miller made the absolute worst decision of his life. The silence stretched for a few excruciating seconds. Officer Miller stared at the heavy gold shield, his thumb tracing the engraved state seal. He looked up at Christopher Hall, then back down at the credentials. The cognitive leap required to connect the black man he had just profiled with the county's chief medical examiner was simply too far for Miller's mind to make. His ego overrode his training. He refused to be embarrassed on his own streets. Miller's jaw tightened. He let out a short, dismissive scoff and shoved the leather credential wallet back through the open window, letting it drop onto Christopher's lap. "Nice try," Miller said, his voice dropping into a harsh, authoritative bark. The polite facade was completely gone. "You think a shiny piece of metal gets you out of a stop? Anybody can buy a fake badge and a leather wallet on the internet for $20. Christopher didn't pick up the wallet. He just looked at the officer. The sheer audacity of the accusation hung in the air. "I'm going to tell you one more time," Miller commanded, taking a half step back and resting his hand firmly on his holster. "Step out of the vehicle, now." It was a direct order. Refusing it would give Miller the exact legal justification he was desperately fishing for. It would allow him to shatter the window, pull Christopher out, and violently escalate the situation under the guise of non-compliance or resisting arrest. Christopher Hall didn't give him the satisfaction. "Understood," Christopher replied. His voice remained a flat, unyielding monotone. He didn't argue. He didn't tell Miller he was making a massive mistake. He simply let the officer continue digging his own professional grave. Christopher unclipped his seatbelt. The mechanical click sounded loud in the tense cabin. He reached over, turned off the ignition, and pulled the keys. He placed them deliberately on the dashboard, in plain sight. Then, he pulled the interior door handle. Miller instinctively stepped back, bracing his stance. The heavy door of the BMW swung open. Christopher stepped out onto the asphalt. He was a tall, solidly built man, and as he stood up to his full height, he naturally cast a shadow over the officer. He didn't puff out his chest or invade Miller's personal space. He simply closed the car door behind him with a solid thud and stood perfectly still. He placed his hands resting lightly on the roof of his SUV, completely visible, his posture relaxed, but completely commanding. "I am out of the vehicle, officer," Christopher said, looking down slightly to meet Miller's eyes. "What is your next instruction?" Miller swallowed hard. The physical reality of the man standing in front of him, the calm, towering presence, the tailored clothes, the total lack of fear, started to crack the officer's confidence. He had expected a fight, a flight, or a nervous breakdown. He hadn't prepared for absolute chilling compliance. Miller unclipped the radio mic from his shoulder. He was in too deep to back down now. He had pulled a man out of his car in broad daylight in the financial district. He had to prove the badge was a fake, or he was going to have a very hard time explaining this stop to his sergeant. "Stand right there," Miller snapped, pointing a black-gloved finger at Christopher's chest. "Don't move a muscle. I'm running your name." Christopher didn't blink. He just watched, waiting for Miller to make his final, fatal move. Officer Miller stood on the asphalt, the midday sun beating down on his dark uniform. He held the radio mic tightly near his collarbone, his thumb hovering over the transmission button. He was staring at Christopher Hall, desperately waiting for the man's confident facade to crack. It didn't. Christopher simply watched him, his hands resting lightly on the roof of the BMW. Miller pressed the button. A sharp burst of static hissed from his shoulder mic. "Dispatch Unit 4, Miller barked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need a priority verification on a county credential. Name is Christopher Hall. Claims to be..." Miller sneered slightly, unable to hide his disbelief. "The chief medical examiner." "Copy, Unit 4. The dispatcher's voice crackled back instantly. "Stand by." The silence that followed was agonizing. 10 seconds passed, then 15. The street traffic continued to flow around them, oblivious to the power dynamic unraveling next to the parking meters. Miller kept his hand near his gun, his eyes locked on Christopher. Christopher just checked his watch, a subtle gesture that communicated exactly how much of a nuisance this officer was to his schedule. Finally, the radio broke the silence. The dispatcher's voice came through crisp, loud, and echoing slightly off the surrounding buildings. "Unit 4, dispatch. Be advised, credentials for Christopher Hall are confirmed and highly restricted. He is the active chief medical examiner for the county, badge number 04 Alpha 0. I'm showing a direct flag from the district attorney's office." "Do you have a homicide scene you need him at, Unit 4? Miller froze. His thumb slipped off the transmit button. The radio fell silent. The words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Confirmed and highly restricted. The blood drained completely from Miller's face. The arrogant, proactive street cop vanished, replaced by a man who had just realized he stepped on a landmine. He had dragged the highest-ranking forensic official in the city out of his car in broad daylight, on zero legal grounds. Miller swallowed hard. His throat was bone dry. He looked down at the gold shield he had carelessly tossed back through the window, then back up at the man standing in front of him. "Dr. Hall," Miller started. His voice cracked. The commanding bark was gone, replaced by a stammering, desperate whisper. We had a BOLO out for a vehicle matching this description. It was a..." "Stop." Christopher didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice a single decibel. But the sheer freezing authority in that one word severed Miller's excuse mid-sentence. Christopher slowly lowered his hands from the roof of the car. He reached through the open window, picked up his credential wallet, and slid it back into his jacket pocket. Then, he looked directly at the nameplate pinned to the officer's chest. "Officer," Christopher said, his tone clinically detached. "You didn't run the plates. You just saw what you wanted to see. And even when you had an out, your ego wouldn't let you take it." Miller opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He was completely paralyzed. "My office works directly with your precinct captain on a weekly basis," Christopher continued, his eyes locking onto Miller's. "I have a dash cam recording this entire interaction. I'll make sure to send him the file so he can see exactly how his officers spend their time on patrol." Christopher didn't wait for a response. He turned around, got back into his BMW, and pulled the heavy door shut with a solid thud. He started the engine. The powerful German V8 purred to life. Officer Miller didn't move. He stood rooted to the asphalt, his hand falling limply away from his duty belt. He watched in complete, suffocating silence as the black SUV smoothly pulled out of the parking space and merged into traffic, leaving him standing entirely alone on the street. "What do you guys think of Dr. Hall's reaction?" Did he handle it perfectly, or should he have called Miller's supervisor right there on the scene? And do you think Officer Miller actually learned his lesson, or is he just sorry he pulled over the wrong guy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you want to see more stories of instant accountability, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.